Welcome everybody. Do you have sound now, David? Maybe just because I wasn't speaking. Do people hear me? Can I get a thumbs
Yeah,
up? Yeah,
thanks, Rod. Yeah.
yeah,
Sí,
excellent. All right, welcome everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to be with you today for the virtual reading group. We are reading Hannah Arendt's book, Between Past and Future. It's the book that Hannah Arendt herself once in an interview said was her best book, her favorite book that she wrote. Um, these essays are it's sometimes complicated, and I think interestingly enough, some of the more difficult things that she wrote at times, and yet also wildly topical and accessible also in another sense, in that they are actually dealing with real world problems. The two we are currently in the middle of, what is authority and what is freedom, are at the very center of Arendt's work. And they need to be read together. If you'll remember the essay, What is Authority, that we read a few weeks ago in two parts, she begins it and says, well, really the question is, what was authority? Because authority is disappeared. And authority, as she understands it, is the free obedience, that we obey freely because the people who we obey have authority. And she thinks that with the rise of the Enlightenment and the modern world, we no longer have this idea of authority. And so she asks the question, well, okay, what is authority? What was authority? But the real question she's asking in that essay is, how do we live together absent authority, right? We have to take seriously that authority doesn't exist. How do we live together absent that authority? In that essay, right, you'll recall it's on page, I think 100 and 101, and actually starting on 99 in the book. She says that in the modern age, both liberals and conservatives see society trending towards totalitarianism. Conservatives see the danger that leads to totalitarianism as the receding of authority, that as authority is lost, there's a kind of liberal excess, not in the sense of not freedom, but almost libertinism, and that this leads to a call for totalitarianism rather than meaningful authority. Whereas liberals see the danger of totalitarianism in receding freedom. She says that these are two sides of the same coin in many ways. And in the essay on what is authority, she goes on to explain that. Just as it's important to know what authority is, though, right? If you want to understand why the recession of authority is important, and how to live absent authority, we also need to know what is freedom. Not a simple question. And this essay that we're in the middle of now, What is Freedom, is her attempt to answer that question. Unlike authority, she doesn't think freedom has disappeared from the world. She thinks that freedom is an ever-present possibility for humans. She does, however, think that we have misunderstood freedom, and that misunderstanding has made it much more difficult to think and imagine what freedom is today. So to recap what this essay is about, we read the first two sections in the last week, and just to recap that a little bit, Arendt wants to recharacterize freedom from how she thinks it's understood today as a property of the individual will to the experience of freedom as acting in public. She says the field where freedom has always been known as a fact of everyday life is the political realm. And that this is, again, with Arendt, one of the absolute essential techniques of reading her is to understand that she is not a philosopher, that she's dealing with often events and deeds and experiences. So when she says that the field where freedom has always been known as a fact of everyday life is the political realm, she's saying we know what freedom is when we act in the world and we can be responded to, right? If I get up and I make a speech and no one hears it and no one responds, she says, doesn't seem, I mean, I may have been free to make my speech, but doesn't seem very free because I can't actually accomplish anything or change anything or impact anything in the world. Freedom for her is to be not only to be able to say and act, to speak and act, but to speak and act in a way that's meaningful, that people hear me. And that's why she says that without freedom, politics would be meaningless, because politics is about a place in which I can act meaningfully in the world, not just, get on the world and run around and do things and be silly and no one sees or hears or reacts, but actually have an impact. And thus, the reason of being of politics is freedom. Politics is there so that I can be free, because without politics, there's no way I can impact the world. Politics in the sense of a plurality and a space where I can act and be taken seriously is there. Politics is there so that humans' freedom can be there. And the whole essay, What is Freedom? She says, is a reflection on this truism. A truism, right, that the reason for the being of politics is freedom, that has been forgotten by the tradition. She thinks that freedom is inherent in action, and as a result, we have to understand freedom along the lines of what she calls virtuosity, from the Greek word from the Roman word virtu, the Greek word arete. It's an excellence, or it's an attribute, right, that allows us a virtuoso is one who can conduct and move people and make things beautiful and make things great. And she thinks that the performing arts are the model for politics, or have a strong affinity for politics, because the performing artists need an audience to show their virtuosity. If you're going to get on stage and give a moving performance, it only works if there's an audience. If you're going to get on stage and play music, again, you can play music in the forest, but it's not, you're not moving people. You're not having an impact. You're not meaning. And so there's no freedom. There's no virtuosity. You need others before whom you can appear to be free. And if we understand the political then, in this sense of the polis, and that the reason for the being of the polis would be to keep a space of freedom alive where virtuosity can appear, this means that freedom needs to be understood as my ability to speak in words and act in deeds so that people listen to me. Now, when I speak in words and act in deeds and people listen to me, they can do a couple things. They can ignore me, right? At which point my freedom is somewhat inconsequential, but it's still an attempt. They can rebel against me or kill me or imprison me because they think that what I'm saying or doing is dangerous. And at least then my freedom, had an impact. It didn't work the way I wanted to, but it tried. Or I can, of course, speak and act in ways that they pay attention and they think, that's pretty interesting. And let me respond to it. And they start a conversation going, and they start to tell a story about what I'm saying. And those stories become part of history. And my freedom and my actions and my words change the world. This is Arendt's understanding of freedom. The ability to speak and act in a public space in which people pay attention to me, and thus my speech and my action matter in ways that either I can be killed or I can change the world. This means, of course, that courage is indispensable to freedom and to political action, because I have to risk leaving the private, entering the public, and acting in a way and my goal is not to preserve my life. My goal is to make a difference in the world, to make the world anew. And so she says, courage means that is indispensable to political action. Courage is indispensable to political action because in political action, in politics, not life, but the world is at stake. And so freedom is about action in the service of a common world. Now, in section 3, which is the first section we read for today, she wants to say that that we have to distinguish this political idea of freedom that I've just been describing from the way we think of freedom today. I think the wrong way she thinks that we think of freedom today, through social theories. She says that in order to understand freedom in its correct way, we have to leave aside our modern social theories of freedom. What is a social theory of freedom? It's freedom that thinks that it's a theory of freedom that thinks that freedom is not about virtuosity and courage to act about the world in public, but it's about my ability to think and will and do what I want in either the private or the social worlds. And she thinks that to think about a new political idea of freedom, we can't go back to the ancient philosophical tradition, because neither the Greek philosophers nor the Christian theologians had a political idea of freedom. They both were anti-political. And so her fundamental point is that philosophical and Christian approaches to freedom think of freedom simply as free will, or as an apolitical or anti-political ability to act as I want. It's the freedom to will, but it's not the freedom to do, in the sense of the freedom to do something virtuously in a way that moves other people. The Christians, she says, associate, or the first ones to associate freedom with the will and the free will. Free will and freedom for the Christians became synonymous in a way that she thinks is largely true for the moderns as well. Freedom for her, as for the Christians, freedom became to be something I experienced in utter solitude and engaged only with myself. Now, not all solitude is something I experience only by myself. The Greeks, she thinks, understood the 2 in 1, the idea of thinking as a thinking with myself and in conversation with myself. And so for the Greeks, there was still this plurality in thinking. But for St. Paul and Augustine, the 2 great Christian thinkers that she addresses, at least in this book, they change the nature of Greek thinking, the 2 in 1, and make it a conflict not between me and myself, or me and others who I imagine, right? Thinking as a letting my mind go wandering, or an enlarged thinking where I think about others' ideas. But now they see it as a thinking is a conflict between my will and also my will not, or what she will call sometimes a counter will. between willing and nilling. I can will to talk to you today, and I can also will that I um, don't talk to you today, and I do not do what I will, right? I could, decide to go downstairs and be part of this conference that I'm supposed to be at today, but I'm not doing that. And I have this, conflict in myself. I can command myself to talk to you today, but I can also command myself to not obey myself. And she thinks that in every will, there's a counter will. There's a, should I do it? Yes. Should I not do it? Um, uh, and whereas for the ancients, when I will something, I want to do it. And as long as there's not an external barrier, like reason or another force greater than me, I will do it. But for the Christians, she thinks the will is broken. It's split. I will to do something. I will to, um, be a good neighbor, but I also will to take the pear from my neighbor's tree. And I have to suppress one side of my will or the other side of my will. And sometimes I will suppress one side and sometimes I'll suppress the other. And so for Christians, it's this constant struggle between my goodwill and my less goodwill that I'm engaged in. And so the problem of free will actually, she thinks, emerges with the recognition that my will is not powerful, that it's impotent, that I will sometimes not do what I will, namely be a good Christian or be a good person or be a good citizen. There will be times when I give into my counter will and don't do it. And so it's out of this feeling of the impotence of my will that I try and strengthen my will as a good Christian or a good citizen or a good rationalist. Um, the fundamental point again is that philosophical and Christian freedom, both for her, think freedom is simply free will. It is the freedom to will, but not the freedom to do it. It's actually the freedom to will, and also with that comes the counter will, and thus the struggle between my willing and my nilling, as she puts it. Now, there are she thinks some thinkers in the modern tradition that somewhat resist this, and the main one that she discusses is Montesquieu, the French aristocratic thinker. And for Montesquieu, freedom is very much like the ancients, not the philosophers, but the ancient actors. Freedom is the power to do what one ought to will. It's the power to do what one ought to will. And Montesquieu thinks I'm not free if I cannot do what I will. Again, this is opposed to the Christian modern idea that will is not a power, but a lack of power and impotence, and thus is like always carries with it the failure of my will. In this modern Christian tradition, another way she puts it is that the mind commands the body, and the body obeys instantly, right? That's sort of the classic idea. But for the Christians, the mind commands itself and it doesn't obey. It resists. It says, be a good citizen, and yet I'm also going to stay at home and watch Netflix tonight instead of going out and speaking in public or going to the diner and talking to my co-citizens about an election or whether we should have a minimum wage or whether we should have tariffs or whether we should have taxes. And thus the will becomes sort of paralyzed as she understands it. So that the moment we will freedom, we become paralyzed in this. I do it sometimes, I don't do it sometimes, and it's all about me. And I lose my capacity to be free. I lose my capacity to act in public because I'm consumed with myself. She then makes a transition on page 161 where she says that if we understand this impotence of the will, we understand how in political theory, in modern political theory, and here she's talking about Rousseau, Hobbes, Locke, and liberal political theory, we equate freedom with the will as will to power. which means that I simply will that I can enact my will, but I'm constantly struggling with my will. And this is, she says, one of the causes of our understanding today that power is to be ruled over or to rule over others as a form of oppression. This is on 161, where she writes, I can only hint here at the fatal consequences for political theory of this equation of freedom with the human capacity to will. It was one of the causes why even today we almost automatically equate power with oppression, or at least with rule over others. So some of you will know that for Arendt, power is not oppression. Power is acting together in a way that we build a world. But because we see freedom as will, right? We see it as an attempt to impose our will over our will. It's an attempt to eliminate the resistance of our counter will. And thus we see a shift in the idea of freedom from power manifest in action to willpower. And insofar as freedom is now willpower, it means to somehow make my freedom absolute, my will absolute. And thus she says that Jean-Jacques Rousseau argues that power must be indivisible. I must somehow eliminate this struggle, this conflict between my will and my counter will. And thus the will and power must be indivisible and sovereign. You know, if for those of you who know some Rousseau, the general will, Rousseau says, is not a combination of many plural wills. It's not an attempt to take all the different wills and have them get in a conversation and talk and find something they agree on. It is a single unified will that we would all have and share if we would will rationally. It's a sovereign will, and it's indivisible. Rousseau imagines that in an ideal state, citizens actually are not allowed to talk to each other, because that if they talk to each other, they would build bonds that would lead them to resist the general will, the sovereign will, and this would cause factions. Arendt sees Rousseau's will as fundamentally anti-political, right? Insofar as politics, she thinks, is about the ties and bonds that we create through an elaborate framework, such as laws and constitutions and treaties and alliances, all of which emerge from people talking to one another and promising and keeping promises in the face of uncertainty and an unknown future. That's how Arendt understands politics and freedom. Rousseau sees freedom as being forced to be free. Either we all agree on the sovereign general will, or if we don't, we are forced to be free, to agree to it. And politically, Arendt says on 162 to 63, politically, this identification of freedom with sovereignty is perhaps the most pernicious and dangerous consequence of the philosophical equation of freedom and free will. So this is the story she's telling in part 3, that free will, that the Christian philosophical evacuation of politics and of the interrelation between freedom and politics leads to freedom becoming free will, leads to freedom becoming a sovereign, indivisible idea, leads to the denial of human freedom as political freedom, as plurality, and thus she says at 163, if men wish to be free, we have to renounce sovereignty and this idea of freedom. The last section of the essay, section 4, is on miracles. Now, why would a secular thinker like Arendt write about miracles in her as the conclusion to her essay on freedom? Well, you have to understand that freedom is not an attribute of the will, but is an accessory of doing and acting. And if that's the case, we need to look for freedom experienced in the process of acting in politics. She goes back to the Greek and Roman languages and says, again, not the philosophers, but to the language itself, and says that The Greek word for action, there's two, archein and proptein, but for archein, which means to begin and to lead and to rule, and for, in Latin, agere, to set something in motion, what both agere and archein have in common for her is that they are setting things in motion. They are leading. And insofar as they lead and they set things in motion, they begin something new. There's a kind of spontaneity. And so to be free requires that one can start something new. And what is starting something new? Well, it's like a miracle. She finds this in the philosophy and the thinking of St. Augustine. Of course, though, not in St. Augustine's mostly religious and theological writing, but in The City of God, his most political work, where Augustine has this famous line that Arendt never tires of citing: "Initium ut esset creatus est homo ante quem nemo fuit," that because man is free because he is a beginning and a beginner. To be human, she thinks, Augustine saw, and that she finds to be this core, is that man is a beginner. He can start things anew. He's a miracle maker. And she says that this could be surprising for a Christian thinker, but actually, if you go back to Jesus, she says, doesn't speak of will. Jesus speaks of faith, and he calls faith a miracle. A miracle is an interruption of a natural series of events or an automatic process, and thus a miracle is an act of freedom. And she thinks that we are all surrounded by automatic processes of nature, right? But also processes of history. And it is against this natural automism of history that we can act and interrupt that automatic process and start something new. And because she thinks the source of freedom remains present, even when political life has become petrified and political action impotent to interrupt automatic purposes, freedom is something that we always have as a possibility. Every act, she thinks, is a miracle seen from the perspective of the automatic processes of the world. So when you see something unexpected, whether it's the result of elections or whether it's a new piece of legislation or a new political leader that emerges that was unexpected, these are acts of freedom, and they interrupt processes of the world. And they are miracles in the sense that when man acts and people pay attention and they tell stories about that person and they build a new world and they realign a political world, very much what's happening right now, that man who acted is a miracle worker. He's an actor for Arendt. And capacity for performing miracles must be, she thinks, within this range of human faculties. And so she says things like, miracles and infinitely improbable events occur frequently in history. So much so that when we even want to speak of them as miracles, we may not want to speak of them as miracles because they happen so often. But the reason this happens is because man is a beginner and that he's an actor. And thus she thinks it's not superstitious or crazy. It's even a counsel of realism to look for the unforeseeable and unpredictable and to be prepared for and expect miracles in the public and political realm. I'll largely end here. She says, if you look at things objectively from afar, like a scientist, it always seems like miracles will be unlikely because you're looking at historical processes and you think the next thing will follow, the next thing will follow, the next thing will follow. And yet there's always are miracles. And if you look closely enough, well, the earth being created was a miracle. Humans being created was a miracle. But so were all sorts of, the creation of polities, the creation of states, the creation of bows and arrows, the creation of guns, the creation of nuclear bombs. All of these miracles happened. and they show human freedom and the human ability to start something new. Some of them, of course, are things you like, and some of the things you don't like. But what she says is, once miracles happen and they create new processes and new automatic processes, it can look pretty dark at times, but there's always the chance that a new miracle will happen and start things anew. Obviously, for those of you who know some of her work, she'll sometimes in other texts call this natality, or the principle that we have always the potential to begin anew. And thus, what is freedom? Freedom is this human capacity to create miracles, to do things unexpected, to interrupt automatic processes, and thus to allow stories to be told in new ways. And that politics is precisely there to allow humans to do this, because this is what it means to be human, to be free, to make meaningful worlds that we share with each other. Okay, so I'll stop there and look forward to a discussion. Obviously, there's a lot happening in the world that might connect to some of this discussion. And I'm happy to talk about that. I just wanted to get without too much prejudice in any one direction, get the idea out there. You can engage in the chat. Please do be respectful. Look, there's a lot going on in the world, and I know there's people on this call who have differing opinions on it. That's great. You're welcome to argue with each other, but just do it respectfully, and remember, attack people's ideas, not their person. You can also go down to the reactions button and press raise hand and engage the conversation with the rest of us. I look forward to an vibrant and exciting discussion. Bob.
Thank you, Roger. At the very beginning of your talk, you said something to the effect, if I got it right, that she is not a philosopher. And that kind of surprised me. I mean, she goes back to the original meaning of words. You know, she parses meanings. She gives examples. So she may not be a philosopher, let's say in a tradition of Kant or Hegel or even Nietzsche, but that's what makes all of them unique and puts them in the category of philosopher in my book. So again, why do you say she's not a philosopher?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I mean, so there's a simple answer to that, which is that she says she's not a philosopher, which, I mean, one can either credit or not credit. So in a number of places, but I think most famously in the 1960, I think 3 interview with Günter Gauss on German TV, Günter Gauss says, you're a philosopher. And she says, no, I have to stop you right there. I'm not a philosopher. And he says, I beg to differ with you. I think you're a philosopher, and I'm not going to be persuaded by you. And she says, well, here's why I'm not a philosopher. And, she says, I call myself a political theorist. I actually don't think she's a political theorist either. I don't believe her that. I think she's a thinker. What I think she means when she says is that she's not a philosopher, is she's not concerned with a conceptual understanding of the world is one thing. 2, as you see in this, and as you saw also in the Concept of History essay and in many other places, she thinks of philosophy as fundamentally a pursuit of truth. And she is not someone who pursues truth, right? She thinks that truth is great for scientists who want to do that, and she think it's great for philosophers who want to argue about what truth is. But she's trying to understand the human world, and she thinks there's no truth in the human world. She thinks that truth and politics don't go together. She thinks that in politics, opinion is what matters, doxa. And she thinks that our entire philosophical tradition, from Plato and Aristotle all the way through Machiavelli, Hobbes, Rousseau, Kant, even Kant to some degree, although Kant is a little more complicated, is a pursuit of truth. And Arendt really doesn't see herself engaged in the pursuit of truth. She's a post-metaphysical thinker. She thinks truth belongs in some places, right, outside of politics, but she sees her efforts. The one book that is somewhat an exception to this possibly is The Life of the Mind, but all the rest of her books are really an attempt to think through human problems, whether the problem of freedom or the problem of authority or the problem of education or the problem of truth in politics. And in these problems, we have to deal with opinions, and we have to argue and persuade and recognize that there are different opinions and understand that there's no one truth. And so, she does go back to Roman and Greek words and agere and archein, and she tries to take clues about what she thinks freedom is, but she doesn't think there's a truth to what freedom is. She says, look, there's a group of people who think freedom is will, and a group of people who think freedom is internal, and then there's the Romans and Greeks. They thought freedom was out in the politics, at least the people acting. And she's making an argument that that's what freedom is, but there's no claim that that's what the metaphysical claim of freedom is, or that's true. She thinks that it's the idea of freedom that fits into a political idea of what it means to be human, and that if we're going to live in this free way, we need to live in a political way. And so that's what I mean when I say she's not a philosopher. It's how she understands herself. But I think there's in this case, I happen to agree with her. I don't think she's a political theorist, but that's a longer question.
So in this case, how are we to understand what she's writing? Just an opinion?
I think so. She writes an attempt to understand, right? And she says, I think there's also Gunter Gauss asked her, why do you write? And she says, I don't write to persuade. I don't write, because it's whatever. I write to understand. She's attempting to understand the world as from her perspective. Now, her perspective is made sharper and better, she thinks, because she thinks about other perspectives. And one of the reasons I think she's such a brilliant thinker and writer is she's so well educated and so open that she considers deeply opinions of many other people, many other brilliant people. Some people have argued that she's limited in perspectives she considers, and they're absolutely right. No one can consider the whole world. And, she doesn't often consider the opinions of subaltern populations or other other traditions outside of the Western tradition, and that's a limit that I think she would probably admit to. But she's an attempt. She thinks as broadly as she can within the context of the 4 or 5 or 6 languages she knows and reads, and engages in conversations with people from Europe and Russia and the United States and wherever she can, with her limitations. And she tries to offer an understanding of what freedom is. It's her judgment. And it's not just it goes beyond simply a prejudice, because she's brought in all these other perspectives and tried to make not a prejudgment, but an articulated, thoughtful judgment. She then puts it out in the world, and she says, look, I'm just trying to understand it. But I don't think it's that alone. I think she's a little too humble. She puts it out in the world because, as she says, these are exercises in thinking. And she wants other people to then engage with her thinking, to broaden their thinking so that they can make their own judgments on these questions. I don't think she thinks, I think she thinks she's right, that she wouldn't write it if she didn't, but she's not right in the sense that this is the final answer. I think she thinks that she's offering what she considers a super thoughtful, considered opinion that's worthwhile to put out there and let other people respond to. Obviously, she hopes that people will to some degree agree with her, but I think she understands that many won't. And but at least if they disagree with her, they'll have to take her opinion into consideration, and that might at least modify or enrich their own opinions. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't think she thinks this is the truth. I think she thinks this is a well thought out opinion.
Okay, well, I don't think humble is an adjective that applies to her, but thank you very much, Roger.
Thanks, Bob. Vigdis.
Yeah, I have two questions. The first is about this when she says that this bondage to the self distinguishes the I will from the I think, which also is carried on between me and myself, but in whose dialogue the self is not the object of the activity of thought. So I wonder if you could say a bit more about these two and the differences between them, and exactly this, as the examples you gave with this conflict with the will was always what you should do. You were tempted from one thing, another thing. So that's his concern with the self. The other is related to a concept of freedom. And where she also says on page 167, what usually remains intact in the epochs of petrification and foreordained doom is the faculty of freedom itself, the sheer capacity to begin. And I think to me, and I wonder your view on this as well, she has a kind of a concept of freedom that is more broadened in a more general term than political freedom. And freedom is the human, as I see it, isn't that our ability to start something new? But when you talk about political freedom, that is that kind of freedom used in relation to the world in the public space. Yeah, that's the two things.
All right. So these were both, I was trying to go from one to the other, and I may have gotten a little bit lost, Vigdis. I apologize. Let's pick one at a time, and go through it. So on 167, you were interested in the question of freedom as the petrification, she says that the truth is that automatism is inherent in all processes, no matter what the origin may be, which is why no single act and no single event can ever once and for all deliver and save man or a nation or mankind. All single acts, right, will eventually lead to a kind of automatism or process. And this goes back to Bob's question to some degree as well, right? Her act of writing this essay, may be a miracle, and it may lead many people to rethink their idea of freedom. But it itself won't save anything, right? It will at some point become automatized in some way until a new act or freedom emerges. No single act can ever once and for all deliver and save a man or a nation or mankind, right? There's no one truth that will be our savior. She says it's in the nature of the automatic processes to which man is subject, but within and against which he can assert himself through action, that they can only spell ruin to human life, right? All processes. Once man-made, historical processes have become automatic. They are no less ruinous than the natural life process. Now, okay, that's the understanding I have of it. What's the question you had, Vigdis? Because I'm not sure I understood it.
It's actually if there is a freedom on a more general term, which is related to the human being's ability to start something new. And that isn't necessarily related to political freedom, but political freedom is kind of what
Okay.
when you use this in a public space.
I get it. Yeah, so I think that, I mean, I guess I would say that I think that the human being's ability to start something new is political freedom. Because to the extent you start something new, you're engaged in, you have to be in a world in which people are watching you and listening to you and reacting to you. And that's a political world. There is no starting something new without politics, without a political world. You know, if I'm sitting alone in my room and I say, aha, eureka, I've got it, I haven't started anything new. I mean, I guess you could say that, well, if I then start talking to myself and changing myself in the sense that I'm a 2-in-1 in the old Greek sense, yes, I could start something new in my life insofar as I am a plural thinking being. But in that sense, I am plural and therefore I'm political. She thinks that all starting something new has to be in conversation. It can't just be you know, in my free will. So yeah, I hope that helps. The bondage to the self, what can you tell me what page you're on? I remember the line, but I don't remember what page.
It's in the middle of page 161. But exactly in the middle
Yeah.
of that middle paragraph.
Right. Like, so that, like, this is complicated material. If you are really interested in it, go back to the chapters in the Life of the Mind on St. Paul and St. Augustine, where she tries to unpack this in over 50 or 60 pages. Here she's trying to do it in a very condensed way. I mean, you know, it always is amazing to me that she got this published. I think it was in the New Yorker. I mean, can you imagine something like this being in the New Yorker today? It's difficult. So, you know, I have to constantly rethink it. So let me, as an attempt to help, you know, you, but help myself, let's read this chapter, this paragraph in the middle of 161 and see if I can help you make sense of it. However that may be, what we usually understand by will and willpower has grown out of this conflict between a willing and a performing self, out of the experience of an I will and cannot, which means that the I will, no matter what is willed, remains subject to the self, strikes back at it, spurs it on, incites it further, or is ruined by it. So I will to drink the water, right? But I also can will, you know, I shouldn't drink the water. I'm trying to talk to you and it's sort of rude. And I should focus on you. And so no matter what is willed, right? There is a conflict between a willing and an experience of an I will and that I cannot, that I, you know, obviously the drinking the water is simple, but I will to curse at you in public, right? But I cannot, or I will to be civil to someone I fundamentally disagree with, but I cannot. And that in this conflict that I have in my will, I remain subject to myself, right? I'm not subject to anyone else. I'm struggling to work out this will. However far this will to power, right, may reach out, right? Whether I will it and succeed or will it and cannot. And even if somebody possessed by it begins to conquer the whole world, the I will can never rid itself of the self, right? I'm constantly worried about, can I or can't I? Should I will or nil? It always remains bound to it and indeed under its bondage. This bondage to the self distinguishes the I will from the I think. So in the I think, I know what's true and I command myself to carry out what's true, right? I should act as a good citizen. I should act as a good neighbor. I should act, you know, according to the moral law, and I will to carry it out. There's no battle right? The battle is only, can I actually do what I know is right? And I try and carry it out. The fact that the I will has become so power thirsty. So, in the sense that, in my will is not something that is controlled by reason. It just wants to assert its will against myself. So it's so the I will has become so power thirsty that will and will to power become practically identical, is perhaps due to its having been first experienced in its impotence. I first experienced my will to be a good Christian in my will to follow the law of my members, as St. Paul says. And in my impotence to be a good Christian, I made my will to be a good Christian a tyrannical will. Tyranny, at any rate, she says, the only form of government which arises directly out of the I will, owes its greedy cruelty to an egotism utterly absent from the utopian tyrannies of reason. It's not one based in reason, it's based in, I need to have my will affirmed, and any resistance needs to be wiped out. And yet I'm constantly met with resistance from myself, and therefore I'm constantly trying to suppress and oppress part of myself. Or if I'm a tyrant, I'm trying to constantly oppress those who would challenge me under me. And so this is the battle of I will and I will not, I will and I cannot, that she imagines. And for her, this is a fundamentally non-political will, because it attempts to it's consumed with the self, and then what it attempts to do is suppress any opposition, as rather than engage in dialogue and talking and bonds and treaties and promises with it. Like I said, this is she's trying to describe what she thinks of as the wrong counter tradition that dominates philosophy from the Greeks to the present, and that she sees originating very much so in Christian theology. I find it at times makes a lot of sense and at times confusing.
Yeah, I
But-
think that for yeah, it's something that it makes sense to think that the will, you're always concerned with yourself and the trouble you have yourself with related to, in a way, I will not. And I don't find it strange that it's related to religion and the problem of, do I believe or do I not believe? I want to believe, but I can't. That seems reasonable. I just want last sentence, because I think it's give some optimism today. That is, Timothy Snyder have a 2-word definition of history, and that is changing continuity. I think that's a good definition. We can hope for change there. And
Right.
it, in a way, sums up what Arendt says about automatism and freedom, don't you think?
I'll accept that. Yes. Thank you. Susan.
So I think you touched on this, and it's on right in the same area as Vigdis's question. On page 160, she says, only where the I will and the I can coincide does freedom come to pass. And then on page 162, she says, it is as though the I will immediately paralyze the I can, as though the moment men willed freedom, they lost their capacity to be free. So it feels like those are contradictory and confused.
Okay. I see that. Where on 160 is the first one? Susan, are you there?
I gotta find it.
I need the words in front of me.
Okay,
It's
yeah,
the bottom,
yeah.
right? So it is as though the I will immediately paralyzed the I can. as though the moment men willed freedom, they lost their capacity to be free. So what she means here is that when we think of freedom as simply the I will, right? I don't have to do anything. All I have to do is will it. I will to I will to say stupid things. I can say them. I can will it, but I don't have to actually do it in the world. I don't have to have the courage to go out in the world and do it. I can imagine myself free simply because I will it, right? You see this all the time. I think it's just think of it as an experience. You hear someone say something you think is wrong or offensive, and you fume inside yourself, and you think, that's idiotic, that's terrible, but you don't go up to them and say, I think you're wrong and let's talk about it, or even anything. You just fume inside yourself. You think, I'm so free, right, that I know this person is wrong and I don't believe them. But your ability to act in public, because you think that you're thinking they're wrong, you're willing they're wrong, is free. You don't actually have to go and do something. It's paralyzed your capacity to be free as a political actor, right? So that's what she means there. On 162, I think you're talking about the top of the page, I think, or where? Where is it? Where are you talking about on 162?
I'm looking.
What was it that you said about 162?
Was, it is as though the I will, well, you were talking there about the paralyzing. So, she says, as though the moment man willed freedom, they lost their capacity to be free. So let me see if I can find it. Yeah, it's
Well, that's on 160.
that's what I have. Okay, I have it 62. It is as though
It is
in
as
the
though,
middle of
that's
the
what I just
page.
read. It is as though the I will
Right.
immediately paralyze the I can.
Right.
As though the
Right.
moment men willed freedom, they lost their capacity to be free. That's what I was just explaining or trying to.
Right. The other one was where she says, only where the I will and I can coincide does freedom come to pass. And that is at the last sentence in the first paragraph on 160. So it just feels like on one hand, she's saying it paralyzes the I will paralyzes the I can. On the other hand, she's saying
All right,
only
so that's
when they
on,
get together are you free.
right. So different things. So this is in my book, it's on page 159, just so
Okay.
you know, at the very
Okay.
top. She says, only where the I will, right, and the I can coincide does freedom come to pass. What she means there is that in political action, right, where when I will, I also act and do something, that's freedom because I'm acting in the world. Whereas on 162, or the first quote you gave, which is on 160 in my book, she says that when I say I will, but I don't then act in the world, I think willing is enough, then I lose my capacity to be free. So I think they're quite consistent. One says that for the in her political idea of freedom, I will means I can. In the free will idea of freedom, I will means I will and I will not, but I don't actually have to do anything. And therefore, one is freedom because it's engaging in the world, and one is not.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you. John Holt.
Hi, Roger.
Hi.
My simple question is,
Simple.
well, no, I think it's simple. Again, on my book, it's page 169. It's towards the end of the chapter. And I'm reading, what usually remains intact in the epochs of petrification and foreordained doom is the faculty of freedom itself, the sheer capacity to begin, which animates and inspires all human activities, etc. And my question is this. This is the only time in this chapter, at any rate, where she refers to freedom as a faculty. I mean, thinking, willing, judging, remembering, memory, anticipation. These are all faculties of the mind. And but here she talks about freedom as a faculty. So that implies that there's something in the human mind that is on the same level of ontic status as memory or judgment or whatever. So your comments on that?
Um, I haven't done a word search. I would be shocked if this is the only time she talks about it as a faculty. Um, uh, by by faculty, she means a facility, an ability to a power to act. This is on 167, by the way, in my edition.
Right.
So freedom for her is precisely a power to act in the world. To have a power, right, is to have a faculty, a facility for it. I don't think of faculty as as a purely intellectual thing. It's a capacity. Maybe I'm misunderstanding faculty, but I think that's how she's using it.
Okay, well, it's a distinctly human attribute.
Yeah, she doesn't think other animals have the faculty of freedom because she doesn't think they're political, right? She thinks that freedom happens only in polis life, in political life, where you have a space where you appear in front of other people and can act and speak in ways that matter. She doesn't think that other animals or beings have that capacity or faculty.
Okay. And so freedom is a faculty that humans have of interacting with one another to create a beginning, to start something outside of automatic processes, because nature is automatic process, and a totalitarian state seeks to have automatic processes, and we have that capacity to interrupt automatic process, which the Christians call a miracle.
Exactly.
Okay, all right. Just curious about the word faculty. That's all.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Catherine. Catherine? Is she there? All right. Catherine, if you come back, let me know. Hannah. Hannah, you gotta unmute. Hold on. Maybe it's me.
Yeah,
Did
I'm
I do
trying.
something?
What?
Oh, now I hear you.
Okay.
Is
No.
Catherine there? Maybe I screwed up. Is Catherine, are you there? No. Okay. Go ahead, Hannah.
So I'm just curious. I mean, so from what I can tell then, she sees freedom as very fleeting in the history of humankind. So in a sense, it's very tragic to me almost because it seems like, it's a tiny, tiny fraction of human history. It's ephemeral. Am I getting the wrong idea? That's all.
I don't think so. I mean, I look, on the one hand, freedom is an ever-present possibility of all humanity. All humans are beginners. We can begin things anew. And so freedom is a basic faculty of man. As is action, right? One of the core faculties of the
Right,
human
I understand
condition
that.
that
Right.
she writes about in her book, The Human Condition, is action. That said, in order to act and be free requires courage. And most of us don't have that courage.
But I'm
Uh,
just looking at the whole of human history. She talks about
Yeah.
beginning revolutions. For example, right now, the Republican Party has a new beginning. You know, people, even us Democrats, see, okay, so maybe something different will happen. Maybe it won't be like the first try. Maybe because he has to have a legacy, he'll stop being such an obscene human. Maybe he won't, you know, all these kinds of thoughts that one has at a beginning. But it seems like the way she's describing freedom in human history, in the long breadth of history, as soon as the beginning is over, it reverts to the same mistake after mistake after mistake after this, after that kind of thing. Am
Yeah.
I getting
No, I
that
think that's absolutely right. I mean, you know, most of human history happens on autopilot, right?
autopilot? That's what she was
Um,
talking about, right? She brought the word in too. Oh, can
yeah.
I just ask you one other thing? Because that was just sort of, can you explain more about the principle thing where she brings in principle? I just didn't get that.
Okay. Um,
Just a little.
yeah. Uh, I can try. Most of human history, right, happens on autopilot. You know, there are now that doesn't mean that there's no freedom at any given time. There's people have freedom to do all sorts of things, but you know, most acts of freedom are inconsequential, right? Most times when people act freely, they're ignored because they go against uh the way other people are acting and seeing it. And so you know, it's a common experience, right? You know, for me, it's a very common experience. I write something that I think is really smart, I put it out there, and no one responds. Um, you know, I was free to do it, but it's inconsequential 99.999% of what I do. Um, Not all freedom is consequential. What determines consequential freedom versus inconsequential freedom? That's a great question. Um, and for her, there's a couple things. One is, in the end, well, first of all, you have a much better chance of having your free act be matter in the world and be consequential the more dangerous your act is to yourself and the status quo, right?
Oh,
The more original you are, and therefore the more outside of the common sense you are, the more chance you have of either being seen as a criminal or a hero. Um, and so you know, there's no doubt, as she says, that um you know, um to the most free uh people are those who, you know, either end up being the greatest criminals or the greatest heroes. She says that in The Human Condition, in the section on action. Um you know, so you know, the more, and so she thinks that to be a great artist or to be a great political thinker, you have to free yourself from the common sense. Now, you can do that in a criminal way and you can do that in a heroic way. What that depends upon is not you, right? That depends on the audience, right? The way that the people in the public world react to you. And over time, the people will tell your story. And, you know, there may be people who act in a way that some people think is criminal and some people think is heroic. And it becomes a contest amongst the audience, the people watching. as to whether that act of freedom will be seen as, in the end, a criminal act that threatens society and need to be punished and expelled from society, or a heroic act that's going to reorient society and change it along profound lessons. I think most of you realize that I'm speaking quite metaphorically for what's going on right now. There's a battle going on, I think, between different parts of the populace to think about how to understand the acts of Mr. Trump, former and future president, and how that story of who he is really, in the end, is not up to him, is up to us, and how we tell the stories that reconstitute the story of what are the values of America around his action, which has clearly been courageous and challenging, and could lead to him either being put in prison or being made into a hero. And so I think that's a helpful way to understand what she's saying here. And the question of principles, right? Which you asked about, which goes back to section 2, on pages, at least in my edition, pages 150 to 151.
Right.
What she's saying is that the kind of action that we're talking about, free action, courageous action, right? Isn't guided by the intellect. I'll use Trump as an example. Why not? We're in Q&A. Let's be a little bold. It's not it's not a question of whether what Trump is doing is true, right? Go back to Bob's original question, or wrong, or false, right? It's not a matter of intellect. She says it's also not under the dictate of the will. It's not just a matter of his self and his will and his not will. She says it springs from something altogether different, which, following Montesquieu's famous analysis, I shall call a principle. When you act according to principles, you're not acting under a judgment in which you judge based on a reasonable intellectual truth and you try and apply it to the world. You're not just commanding, right? As much as maybe some people want to think of Trump as someone who wants to be an authoritarian or a fascist or something. I don't think that's how she would understand him. Commanding here will, but he's acting according to, at least if you think of him as an actor, a principle. And principles do not operate from within the self as motives do. Right now, obviously, there's parts of Trump that operate under things like vengefulness and just meanness, and he is vengeful and mean, and in some ways, some of his actions come from that. I would suggest to you that one of the things we have to do is make a distinction between Trump, the vengeful, willful, kind of commander, or in this case, authoritarian, right? Willful person, tyrant, and Trump, the person who acts according to principles which are not from within himself, but from without, as she says, much too general to prescribe particular goals, although every particular aim can be judged in the light of the principle once the act has been started. For unlike the judgment of the intellect, which precedes action, and unlike the command of the will, which initiates it, the inspiring principle becomes fully manifest only in the performing act itself. So what's the principle of Trumpianism? Again, I think you have to look at it in the acts that have been started, and I think part of it is heterodoxy, right? And I think part of what is attractive to people and about Trump is that in a time of incredible intellectual, moral heterodoxy, homogeneity and orthodoxy amongst the liberal and even conservative intellectual and elite classes, there is a joy and fun that Trump brings to politics in heterodoxy. And that is, I think, a deeply American value, and one that he is celebrated for. I think another aspect of Trump is a kind of return to gut instinct and going with your feeling rather than trying to plan everything. And again, I think that that's a principle that has deep roots in the American yeoman farmer tradition, and and that Trump is here elevating in his own way.
Do you think principle is like value in this sense? Do you think it's synonymous with values?
It's not values. I mean, the examples that she gives from Montesquieu are honor, glory, and love of equality, right?
Well, those are kind of values.
They are kind of values, yeah. But they're what their value, but what they get expressed, she thinks, in the action, and that you have to, in the course of the act, in which they are executed, in cooperation, the principle which inspires it loses nothing in strength or validity through execution. Yeah, I mean, there's a way in which they're values. The idea is that they're guiding principles or values that are being articulated in action.
Okay, I'm getting it now.
And
I get it as values, which I understand very well.
Okay.
Values.
And in this case, Mr. Trump, President Trump, is acting in a way that is bringing certain principles, or if you want, values, to be in the world, right? Now, again,
Right.
the problem with Trump is that he has many different sides of himself, and there's a part of him which is a petty tyrant and
Right.
vengeful man-child that threatens to undo fundamental principles of equality and lawfulness and democracy that are fundamental qualities of the United States, right? That's the problem with someone like Trump as an actor, because he's an imperfect, quite imperfect
Right.
vessel for this.
Right.
And yet I hope you start to see why I think he's an
Exactly.
interesting character to think about in this context.
Exactly. Thank you so much.
Catherine, are you back or not? All right, Anne Marie.
Hello. I'm not sure what I was going to say is apropos anymore, because it was a reaction to what people were saying about Will. But I'm befuddled by this essay. It's so complex and befuddling. In fact, Hannah Arendt warns us from the very first sentence on to raise the question, what is freedom? Seems to be a hopeless enterprise. I was going to say about Will that I don't think it's almost not interesting to Hannah Arendt, because the self is not the object of thinking. But also she talks about Will almost like Kenyette as the domain of dictates and commands. And people who remember Kenyette's amazing section in Massa Unmacht on the command is something pre-linguistic, at the heart of which is the threat of death. It's very interesting to think about what she has to say about Will. I wonder if anybody knows whether Kenyette read Arendt and vice versa. That's a true question. But I guess in the end, what really strikes me I thought I was beginning to understand things in terms of something like a phenomenology of freedom. We don't know anything until it becomes manifest. But it's so odd to me. And again, what I'm struck by more than anything else is is a kind of darkness, which isn't an unknowing, but a true darkness, in which things light up and appear or manifest themselves, to use the word. Hannah Arendt herself seems to love this word strange, and even stranger she uses. It's very interesting to me. And I wonder how all of this relates to her notions of eternity, her first work on St. Augustine and love as the antidote to so many terrible things. I'm struck by her real insistence on anti-interiorization. She's not, in terms of this essay and freedom, which she sees as, again, as somebody just said, quoted her, the faculty of beginning. But there's some sort of darkness that is, I wonder whether this is correct. Please tell me. A collectivity of sort, a kind, you get the feeling almost of like, I hate to say it, Jung's acausal connecting principle between people, that these sentiments that appear out of who knows where. And in fact, beginning with her claim that the concept of freedom appeared first and only then with Saul's conversion to Paul. What she says is, quote, the experience of religious conversion, which is almost like taking the realm of physics and the notion of freedom in physics and applying it to human life and collective life. But again, this dark background is what's really very interesting. And her language.
Emery, let me, because we're running out of time.
Yeah, that's enough.
Let
But
me
you get the
try and
idea.
answer this.
Some strange darkness.
I mean, you might look at her book, Men in Dark Times, right? In which she says, that, dark times are not necessarily times like totalitarianism, although that was one, but dark times are when, everybody goes along doing the same thing. There are times of automatism and lack of action in which people don't have the courage to act in public, and basically the world, stops in some way. And that she says we as humans have the right to expect illumination, light. And that those light comes from people, men, she means people, men who act, and who light up the world of darkness in their actions. And so, yes, I think that's very much how she understands it. I don't think, I'll just add that what she thinks, one of the core ideas of what she thinks it means to be human, which includes acting and thus being free, is also not eternity, because every action will eventually lead into a kind of petrification that will need to be reacted against with new events and new miracles, but immortality, and immortality for her is achieved by humans who act in such a way that they become the subject of stories, and they become people who we talk about. And what she says is that is the sort of, that she goes, the line between, humans and animals is the line between those who act in public in ways that achieve immortality, which means that, again, this is a part of Arendt that is uncomfortable to many today. There are people who are more fulfilling of their humanity than others. That doesn't mean they're not human, because for her, humanity means the potential to do this, and all humans should have that right and must have that right. And so she doesn't. This is not an argument for taking away those rights, but she does think that there are humans who are more fulfilling of that potential to act and be free, and thus deserving of immortality than others. And that is not something that you can run away from in her work. Bernie, you'll get the last question.
All right. You stated earlier that Hannah Arendt, when she was denying that she was a philosopher, proclaimed that there is no truth. And I'm just wondering, is there some specific site, maybe it's already in this book, but I don't recall it, where she makes that declaration? And number two, I'm wondering, to me, that's so evocative of what Michel Foucault would ultimately say in 1977 in his interviews on Truth and Power, that there is no truth, there are only regimes of truth. Would Arendt have agreed with that?
No. So first, to your first question, I didn't say that she says there's no truth, or if I did, I misspoke. What I wanted to say is that she says there's no political truth. There are rational truths, and there are potentially moral truths or scientific truths, but not political truths. Yes, she has talked about this already, but she will talk about it much more in the the penultimate essay of the book, called Truth and Politics, and that is the theme of that essay. So when we get there, we'll obviously get to revisit this question. On the question of Foucault and regimes of power and truth and power, no, I think Arendt and Foucault fundamentally disagree on this question. For Foucault, truth is something manifested through discourses of power, right? Arendt, and that therefore it becomes some sort of socially constructed truth, and that the truth is done through, well, as you said, power. Arendt thinks that truth is something that we should, on the one hand, be allergic to in politics. On the other hand, we need it. And here she's actually quite close to Nietzsche on this. Nietzsche thinks that there is no truth. Truth is a woman. Truth is constantly fleeting. And yet he says we can't live without truth. And Arendt has I think a quite similar position. The difference between her and Foucault is that she doesn't see truth as something constructed through discourses of power. She sees truth as something that is constantly emerging and constantly being challenged and rethought. It's the ground we walk on and the sky above us, as a metaphor she'll use at the end of the Truth and Politics essay. And yet it's always a prejudice, but the very essence of politics is to constantly challenge prejudices and make them less prejudices and more thoughtful, informed judgments. And so truth is neither, something absolute or lasting, but also neither is it simply a regime of the powerful. It's something that has to constantly be negotiated and renegotiated and rethought and challenged, but without without denying the history out of which it comes. In fact, this will be something we discuss next week when we do the crisis in education essay, because what she wants to say about education is that education has to be both conservative and radical. All education, she thinks, has to conserve history in the past and teach us on the basis of the world we live in, the truth on which we stand and the sky above us. And yet all education has to be radical in that it opens the possibility for rethinking and retelling and reconstituting that truth and that story. And so I think that's quite a different approach than Foucault has. It's a much more, Foucault's is a much more dark and static idea, whereas Arendt's is one of politics, not power. All right. Thank you
Thank
all
you.
very much. Look, this is if ever there's a time in which we all need exercises in thinking, this is it. We need to start rethinking things, and we are at a time in which, at least in the United States, but really around the world, the true order, the liberal order, the order that we have lived under for at least 70 years since post-World War II, and maybe longer, depending on how you think about it, is being challenged. It's not the first time it's being challenged. It was challenged, for example, in the 1920s and 30s around the world. One answer is to simply reassert it. And another answer says, well, the tradition is broken. That means we need to rethink how we live together. And we need to have the courage to put our perspectives into the world and risk being ignored or ostracized or potentially imprisoned or killed, but also risk being listened to. This is a time in which we have choices to make. We can retreat into our private lives, into an internal immigration. And by the way, she thinks that's a perfectly legitimate choice to live a life in that way. Or we can engage in politics at a time in which we are about to embark on in a process of rethinking and reimagining our world and our society. All of us have that choice, and if anything, these exercises and thinking in this book are absolutely essential in preparing us to engage in that project. I wish you enjoying Hannah Arendt, reading Hannah Arendt, and I will see you next week. Thanks very much.